Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this members' meeting on interpreting China's North Korea policy. We have with us today Dr. Andrew Scobell, Senior Political Scientist at the RAND Corporation. He's also an adjunct professor at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He's held positions at Texas A&M and at the U.S. Army War College, among other prominent institutions. And he is specialized in the study of Chinese strategy and security policy. And I think your most recent book, Andrew, was actually looking specifically on the role of the People's Liberation Army in terms of policy formulation with regard to China. But today we're here to discuss China's attitudes in particular towards North Korea. We had a delegation to China at the ISS recently, where we spent a week there. And in the course of that week, we've met people from the military, from the party, from various prominent think tanks. And unsurprisingly, the question of North Korea came up a few times. And what we had was sort of a sense of bafflement, the occasional frustrated shrug, expressions of concerned anxiety. And none of that was really new, which was sort of surprising given that the North Korean leadership has been ratcheting up the pressure with its claimed nuclear and missile tests of late. And it did raise the question in my head as to what China's pain threshold was that might, if breached, force it into a different posture from the one that it's been adopting for many years. And I think, Andrew, in your presentation, you will set out the fact that the issues for China are very multidimensional, complicated, and multi-layered, and that China arrives at conclusions and positions that outsiders often find perhaps difficult to understand as a result of that. So thank you very much for coming. You're going to speak for about 20 minutes. You have a presentation, and then we'll do Q&A. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Adam, for that kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be at IISS today, talking about one of my favorite topics. Some years ago, I jokingly said to someone in a building in Washington, I said, I keep trying to look at other topics, but I cannot escape from North Korea. And I said that, flippantly, and of course the person I was talking to said, well, a lot of people have that problem. And so it's not so funny, really. But again, I can't help but be, you can either laugh or cry about some of these problems. And so I particularly like this cartoon, and hopefully you may go away at the end of the session saying, well, I don't know about the presentation, but the cartoon was great. I do think that sort of encapsulates Xi Jinping's feeling about his border buddy. So, of course, what I'm about to say represents no one's views but my own, and it's incomplete research. I ought to emphasize it's just a tidbit. So I'm happy to address any questions or discuss other things in the Q&A. So, how do we make sense of China's North Korea policy? And I've been looking at this for several decades, and I still don't claim to be an expert. I'm certainly reasonable. I think I'm reasonably well informed. I have my own theories, some of which I will share with you in the next few minutes. So, a big part of this China's North Korea policy, especially if you're sitting in Washington or London or Seoul or Tokyo, or practically any capital, is what about those North Korean nukes? And so I think the important question is, where does the issue of North Korea's nukes, or specifically denuclearization, fit in Chinese thinking about North Korea? And related to that, I'm still fighting to get the study published, but looking at, if things go south in North Korea, what might China do militarily in terms of intervention? And so, in a sense, red lines meaning, what will it take for China to change its policy, or what might prompt China to act decisively where North Korea is concerned? And then some closing comments. So, for the U.S., China is the key player in addressing North Korea. successive administrations in Washington, they come into office and think, typical can-do American spirit, we are going to solve this North Korea problem. So let's do a policy review. You do the policy review. It takes many months. The conclusion, shocking conclusion, the key is China. If we can just get China on board, we can solve this North Korea problem. And you see that I'm being somewhat facetious, but not by much. So this is China is seen as critical in addressing, making progress on the North Korea issue, especially as it's framed from a U.S. perspective, largely as a nuclear or denuclearization issue. So actually, that second paragraph, officially, if you look at Chinese official statements, so the foreign ministry and elsewhere, you never see the three no's. But that's in essence, that's what analysts, Chinese analysts, scholars, and in quasi-official discussions, that's what it boils down to, the three no's. No war, no chaos, no nukes. So I think that in essence sums up the official policy, even though that's not the official formulation. And you'll see why I'm beating that horse in a minute. Chinese leaders, I think, tell their American counterparts what they want to hear, which is, that nuclear problem is huge, and we understand how you feel about it, and we are also very concerned about this, and we can work together. And that's the line you get repeatedly, and I think it's partly there's a lot of sincerity in that. Perhaps the most visible recent example is the Sunnylands Summit of the summer of 2013, the so-called shirt sleeve summit, when I think the two leaders, looked into each other's eyes and they figured we can do business. That's and importantly for our discussion today, that North Korea was a key part of that. I think the Obama administration came away from that meeting thinking, yes, the Chinese finally understand that this is how important this issue is, and we're pretty much on the same page. So that's if you have discussions with Chinese officials, Chinese analysts, as I have done, you get the sense that Xi Jinping has a different policy on North Korea. You will basically hear this, that Xi Jinping is tougher on North Korea. So China's policy has changed. I think at RAND we like to do the research and see if the data bears this out. So we've in this project got a team of researchers looking at Chinese views, three types. What we call official views, the kind of things you'd expect, official statements, documents, commentaries, and quasi-official track. What might be called track 2, or what I like to call track 1.5, where you have scholars and officials discussing matters off the record, and then unofficial, basically what talking heads will say, what you read on Chinese social media or in Chinese tabloids. So if you, going back to what I was saying a moment ago, from the quasi-official and unofficial views that you hear and read suggest that of those three no's, number one at the top of Xi Jinping's hit parade is denuclearization. And I think most people point to the third nuclear test in February of 2013 as being the straw that broke the camel's back, that this was enough. It was time. Beijing decided it was time to get tough with Pyongyang. So before that, it was more about stability. Yes, the nuclear problem is worrisome, but the bottom line, we don't want instability on China's borders, let alone war. So we really need to focus on that. So supposedly things have changed. I think if you look at some of the official messaging channels, it tells a somewhat different story. So on this chart, it's a little busy, but the green line shows Ministry of Foreign Affairs website. So when we talk about articles, it's the number of statements on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website in Chinese, I might add. That's what we looked at. Also, so that's the green line. The blue line is Renmin Herbal, People's Daily, and the red line is the Liberation Army Daily, Jiefang Jinbao. So this is the frequency with which statements about North Korea include the word denuclearization. So, okay, it's only one measure, but I think it's a useful measure, and actually to emphasize, or I think to underscore that there might be something to this. If you look at the frequency, it fluctuates over time, and particularly what I call the first nuclear crisis back in the early 90s, you see an uptick. And after 2002, the second nuclear crisis, you see an uptick. So it does suggest that it's telling a story. It's telling some story here, and it also fluctuates based on the nuclear tests that North Korea has conducted. So what I think is important to take away from this, one official outlet cares more about denuclearization or uses the term more often than others. And that's directed at a foreign audience. So it doesn't look quite so cut and dry that denuclearization is job number one all the time, or even that it's been increasing over time. If you look at this second graph, this is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, a comparison in red. You see use of the term, a percentage of statements on the Foreign Ministry's website using the term denuclearization, and in the blue line shows stability, or Wending and Wuha. So again, you can see that stability, even on this Chinese Foreign Ministry website, stability is used more frequently, with greater frequency than denuclearization. Just as with the last graph, the significant fluctuation, but you don't tend to see a clear indication that denuclearization is priority number one, at least from this. If you look at this. This graph looks at Renmin Herbal, People's Daily articles on North Korea, again comparing stability versus denuclearization as a percentage of articles on North Korea. So stability, again, the blue line, the red line, denuclearization. So I think it's logical to suggest that the People's Daily is aimed at a domestic audience, and clearly stability seems to rank as a more important topic than denuclearization. And I don't think these things are necessarily surprising. I think it's important to see what the data suggests. So there are other things we can and do measure, but this is one way to sort of test what people are saying, what Chinese officials and scholars are saying. So here you see some quotes by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, both in 2014 and 2016. It was made in conjunction with the two meetings in March of the National People's Congress and the other the other house of the legislature. With the emphasis on talking tough. China, when he used the term red line, he emphasized in 2014, the foreign minister emphasized China won't stand for war and instability on the Korean Peninsula, and somewhat reiterated, more or less reiterated the point more recently in this March. I think one obvious takeaway from this is he's not naming names. Of course, that tends to be the Chinese way. You don't single out publicly by name, and yet it's not even signaling to. It's clear that this is not just signaling to Pyongyang. It's to all parties to act with reason and care and refrain from aggravating tensions. So there are red lines, but they're somewhat ambiguous, and as we know in Washington, sometimes it's good to be a little ambiguous about red lines, because otherwise you might end up blushing. Still raises questions in my mind. What would Chinese reaction be to nuclear contamination from a North Korean nuclear test? What would China's reaction be to the actual use of a nuclear weapon by North Korea, even if it was defensive in nature? We could speculate about how that might happen. Why do I raise these questions? Well, I'm particularly interested in North Korea's nuclear program, but I've also, from research associated with this project, been looking at Chinese social media. And you see, most of the Chinese social media discussion about North Korea is about how fat Kim Jong-un is. Things, the sort of pop culture type things that you'd expect. So I don't want to give you the wrong impression that millions of Chinese netizens are weighing in on North Korean policy. No, that's not true. But it certainly is an important topic now on Chinese social media, and there are different strands going on, and it's permissible. I think that's an obvious point that we shouldn't overlook. Debate on North Korea is permissible both by ordinary people and by elites. And so you see an unprecedented discussion. And that concern about the nuclear program and radiation and contamination is also voiced increasingly by Chinese elites in their commentaries and discussion too. So that's why I raised that question. It does seem that there is heightened concern in China about North Korea's nuclear program. Does that translate into that being priority one? I think the evidence that I've presented today and the evidence that I've gathered it suggests it's not 100% clear. So to wrap up, has China's North Korea policy toughened up? The answer is somewhat ambiguous, I think. As I said, frustration. I think frustration is. Evidence suggests that people in Beijing and elsewhere in China, both elite and ordinary people, are incredibly frustrated with North Korea. And so I don't think it's any exaggeration to say it's the highest it's been in quite a while. And there's significant displays of displeasure by Beijing, both in terms of symbolism. Xi Jinping hasn't yet visited North Korea. He hasn't received the North Korean leader. He has met on multiple occasions with the president of South Korea, so Xi Jinping is sending signals to North Korea that that the Chinese are not happy, and signed on to sanctions. We'll see how those actually play out in terms of implementation. But the signals are clear that China's not happy. How far beyond that it goes, it's still too early to say. And while denuclearization may not be priority one, it certainly seems to be a higher priority. Now, I've got a quote there from the Global Times, which of course is the tabloid offshoot to the People's Daily. So what one can debate about, does that statement represent an official view by the Chinese leadership? I would argue it does. Right? We can quibble about that. But who is it aimed at? Who reads the Global Times? Well, elites and ordinary people in China. In fact, the Global Times has arguably become the most important platform for debating about the public debate about North Korea in China. So, what I take away from that editorial, unsigned editorial, is the Chinese leaders are signaling to the Chinese people, look, we hear you. We know you're upset. We know that North Korea has been misbehaving. However, at the end of the day, we cannot, it would be irresponsible for China to abandon North Korea. So, I'm going to stop there, but I'm going to make a shameless plug for my latest book, PLA Influence on China's National Security Policy Making. There is a chapter in there on the PLA and North Korea policy. So it's published by Stanford University Press. Phil Saunders of America's NDU, US NDU, and I are the editors. So I think it's I know I always say this in Washington. Nobody has time to read a book in Washington. Right? Nobody has time to read a book in London. You're all very busy people. However, you can pick up something like this and maybe read one chapter that's of particular interest to you, right? And help our sales. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We now have some time for questions and comments as well. Maybe I can just kick things off while other people are reflecting by just referring to this point that you made towards the end of your presentation about the official line that China's been putting out about the strategic and geopolitical value of North Korea as a buffer against an American alliance system. And I guess at face value one can sort of understand how one could rationalize that. But would it not also be true to say that it is North Korea's actions which are importing more of America into the region, which provide a continuing rationale and validity for American alliance structures in that part of the world, that provide, some critics might say, a convenient cover under which Japan can continue a process of military normalization that might actually primarily be aimed at China, not at North Korea, or at least aimed at apprehensions about China. So how are these circles squared? Because I have to think that there must be at least somewhere in the Chinese leadership somebody thinking North Korea asset, North Korea liability,
yes.
And the balance is shifting on a continual basis.
Yeah, I think it is most people you talk to in China would agree that it's North Korea is the biggest, most complicated challenge, a foreign policy challenge Chinese leaders face. And there are a fair number of complicated challenges. U.S.-China relations being one of them. There's some pretty complex issues that China's facing. But North Korea is pretty high up there. After all, it's the only flashpoint. If you think about flashpoints, one might be the South China Sea, another the Taiwan Strait. It's the one the Korean Peninsula is the one flashpoint where there is a Chinese ally involved. Right? China doesn't do alliances, except there's only one official ally that China has from a treaty still in force from 1961. That's of course North Korea. Now, its alliance with North Korea is not like anything that most people in this room are familiar with, or Americans. We have the U.S. has allies. I'm proud to be proud that includes the United Kingdom, right? But we can, the United Kingdom and the U.S. We conduct exercises. We share intelligence. We do all kinds of things. There's on a wide array of fronts. To the best of my knowledge, that does not characterize China's alliance with North Korea. They don't exercise together. thank goodness maybe, or maybe it would help. I don't know, but it's certainly a very different kind of alliance. And if you think about this from a geostrategic perspective, kind of along the lines of that last quote, from a Chinese perspective, this is not just about North Korea. This is about the U.S. So yes, as Adam pointed out, they're increasingly North Korea is seen as a liability. But if you look at this from a geostrategic perspective, and Northeast Asia in particular, which arguably is the most sensitive region for China, it's very close to the political and economic heartland of China, what's the balance of power? It looks pretty firmly in favor of the United States. You've got the Republic of Korea, South Korea, Japan, strong U.S. allies with potent militaries and very dynamic economies. In contrast, what does China have? Well, you can't really call, speaking of allies, you can't really call the Russians allies. Okay? And even though there may be a meeting of the minds on North Korea, so what's China left with? It's a sorry excuse for an ally. It's pretty pathetic, but it is an ally, and it is in a very, very sensitive region for China, area for China. So, it's complicated. The dialogue, the debate about North Korea, I think it's unprecedented, and the sense of ire and anger against North Korea, I don't think I haven't ever seen it this strong. However, at the end of the day, it's not just about North Korea. And as I think this, I don't want to point to this one piece of evidence as the critical piece of the puzzle. But I think what this editorial underscores is how the Chinese leaders think about this problem, and they're trying to communicate that to the Chinese people. So sorry for that long-winded answer.
I think one way they had of characterizing their relationship in the past was to say that it was as close as lips and teeth. And to which you might be tempted to reply that there's plenty of signs of gingivitis and tooth decay. But anyway, Nigel Inkster.
Yeah, hi. Nigel Inkster, on the staff of IISS, and shameless plug of my own author of a soon-to-be published book on China's cyber power.
Good.
Essentially, the Chinese have made the point in different fora that in effect the original sin of the Korean Peninsula problem is the United States' failure to negotiate a peace accord with North Korea. Where does that contention fit into the narrative that you have been talking about, and where does it fit in, if at all, in discussions formally between China and the United States?
Okay, good question. I think it fits in the sense that, from a Chinese perspective, even though, as I've just said, and we all agree this is a problem, this is a big problem for China. From a Chinese perspective, the problem, it's really a U.S. problem. And the U.S., maybe some mirror imaging going on, whereas in Washington, people say, China's the key to this. Sitting in Beijing, they look and say, well, Washington's the key to this. And so they throw it back in Washington's face, and if you just were nicer to North Korea, or less facetiously, if you were less threatening, then I think that the North Koreans might come around. And I've been hearing this for literally 2 decades now from analysts in Beijing. Well, look, the North Koreans, they're about to adopt Chinese-style reforms, and they're getting there. However, the problem is that the U.S., in this threat environment, they're not going to do that. They're not going to dive in unless relations with Washington improve dramatically. And they draw the parallel with normalization between the U.S. and China. Right, the reforms, the post-Mao reforms, really weren't able to get off and running without rapprochement or full rapprochement between the U.S. and China. And the same thing they argue is true in the case of North Korea. And they're probably right. And yet, from a U.S. perspective, you look and see, well, how well have the North Koreans done in living up to their promises? Now, I fully recognize that there have been promises broken on both sides. I think that's important to admit. But from a Washington perspective, is why do we want to get involved in the same old, when there's no indication from Pyongyang that they are sincere about wanting to? So you don't want to tear things up and start all over again. I think that would be a big mistake. So in this sense, the Chinese emphasis on the six-party talks, returning to the six-party talks, is not a bad thing. How realistic that is a question mark. I think going back to the six-party talks and holding all sides, but especially North Korea, accountable for what has been signed so far, the agreements, the accords that have been reached so far, I think is an important way to go. Does that mean that all six parties need to sit down at one time? No, not necessarily. And does that mean there are some of those six parties are more important than others? Yes, of course. I think that's true. So I think the danger, and my South Korean colleagues always emphasize, I think it's true. Why does North Korea keep emphasizing a peace treaty? Right? And why do they? Because when they think about a peace treaty, they want to sign it with the U.S. They don't want to deal with South Korea on this. And so, in some ways, that talk of a peace treaty is about breaking up an attempt to break up or undermine an alliance. I think we need to be attuned to that. At the same time, it doesn't necessarily have to be synonymous. And can there be a grand bargain? I think it's certainly possible. But I don't see the indicators from North Korea that they're ready for that. Now, we're of course witnessing a big. I think it has started yet. The North Korean big party Congress hasn't started yet. It starts at the end of the week, does it? Yeah. So we'll see what comes out of what comes out of that, because just as a lot of what, or a significant amount of what Chinese leaders say is actually directed to domestic audiences, I think we need to be open to the possibility that a lot of what North Korea does and what the rhetoric is actually, it may be ostensibly aimed at foreign outside audiences, but it's also not ignoring domestic audiences. So maybe if Kim Jong-un feels like he's beaten his chest enough, and he's got the military on his side, completely under his thumb, and the party everything's in order, then maybe after this Congress and a decent interval, it may be time to seriously re-engage with the U.S. And maybe the timing, putting on my optimistic hat, maybe the timing is auspicious because we have an election, as you might have noticed, going on in the U.S. And so on the negative side, we have a lame duck administration who almost certainly is not going to do anything new on North Korea. But on the positive side, you've got a new administration that will be coming in that may be receptive to coming into readdressing the North Korea problem with some fresh ideas.
Thank you. One of the things that intrigues me a little bit about the saber rattling on this point of whether it's aimed at domestic or foreign audiences, that what seems to be happening is that the party is, after many years, being given more of a role, more public prominence, after a period in which it was all army first. Mm-hmm. So whether some of this is intended to assuage the concerns of the military, the KPA, that they will still have a very privileged position, and that the leader has a complete commitment to all of the means and sources of national deterrence and defense, but still the power centers are going to be slightly realigned, and that the party congress is part of that. Yeah. I mean, that may be part of the, I don't know, maybe part of the calculation. Cho Kong, please.
Thank you, Adam. Cho Kong from Shell. You didn't mention, at least didn't hear, you didn't mention China's border provinces with North Korea, which are largely Korean-speaking,
yes,
to a large degree Korean-speaking. And they're also part of the Rust Belt economy, the areas of manufacturing China needs to move out of if it's to modernize its economy. Now, we've had reports of labor unrest in the border regions. To what degree does China's concern with stability in North Korea, to what degree is it a consequence of its concern also over stability in that part of China itself?
A very good observation and question. Yes, I think it is very much on Chinese leaders' minds the borders, the provinces that immediately border North Korea, and so. Historically, the ethnic Korean minority in China has been seen sort of a model minority. They work hard, they have Confucian values, and they're, and yet with the prospect at some point in the future of a unified Korea, perhaps, or possibly, it's a little worrying, concerning to Chinese leaders that there may be. That may raise enthusiasm for a larger Korea, and so this is a concern for Chinese leaders. But also, as you mentioned, the political or the economic health of those provinces. And I haven't checked this in the last few months. But if you look over the last few years, what's noticeable, dramatic, is the increasing Chinese economic interaction with North Korea. Investment, trade. Of course, for quite a while, China has been the number one trading partner of North Korea. Official statistics, you can't really take them at face. First of all, they don't seem to really exist. You have to do some really good detective work, the kind that people like Nick Eberstadt and Marcus Dolan do. But it does suggest that increasingly North Korea has become an economic appendage to China, and shifting from aid to actual investment. So aid that may disappear, but switching to an investment where China can extract resources from North Korea. And what is also dramatic is if you look at at the infrastructure that's been built, the bridges across the Yalu, the rail connections, the road connections, it's really quite remarkable how that. Of course, they all stop at the border, and you look south of the Yalu, and the infrastructure is in atrocious shape. But those, why are those being built? Well, I think a large part of the answer is to try and develop North Korea's economy and improve stability, benefits for China, improve stability across the border, which will hopefully improve economic development across the border, which will ideally, hopefully help improve stability on the Chinese side of the border. But I can't help but also think there's another byproduct to these improved infrastructure, and that is it makes the movement of troops much easier. And I'm not trying to imply that that Beijing is or the PLA is eager to refight the Korean War or even go into North Korea. I think there's a recognition that what's at stake here are China's vital interests. And when any country's vital interests are called into question, that country is likely to take those things very seriously, and no options should be ruled out.
Mahmoud Ali.
Thank you. I'm just a member of this institute interested in China and its foreign policy, as I was talking to you a few minutes ago. Thanks very much for sharing your insights. The question is, what would it take for North Korea and all its interlocutors to make the six-party talks something similar to P5+1 on Iran? What other fundamental difference, except that North Korea does have nuclear weapons and possibly some rudimentary delivery system, but apart from that, what is the difference that makes North Korea so difficult to handle?
Well, it's much more difficult, much more complicated for China because North Korea is a radioactive Darfur on the doorstep, right? It's not halfway around the world. It's not in the Middle East or North Africa. It's right on China's doorstep, and in fact, Foreign Minister Wang Yi used that term, "Mengkou," right, which means gateway or doorstep, and I think that's the way Chinese see North Korea. It's the gateway to the northern plain, to China's political and economic heartland. So, just the geographically, just looking at that makes it different. It's interesting you raised the Iran nuclear deal because China played a significant role in reassuring Iran, and I don't think it's a good example of what China can do, the constructive role that China can play. But I'm suggesting it's very different when that country is in the Middle East versus right on China's doorstep.
I want to get everybody's questions in if we possibly can. So can we take two at a time? Is that all right? Rick Grove and then Nicholas McLean, please.
Rick Grove from Runner Associates in New York. Andrew, question about China's increasing frustration in the last few years with North Korea. Has that led to any increased willingness on the part of the Chinese to talk about coordinated responses to worst-case scenarios, especially use of nuclear weapons by North Korea, coordination politically, but perhaps even military coordination in response?
Nicholas.
In your tracking of coverage of issues like nuclear and denuclearization or ability, did you also look at the issue of improving capability of ICBM delivery? Because that seems to be the whole missile aspect almost as important as the load that missiles would carry.
Okay, to answer that question first, no, we didn't, for better or for worse. But it is the whole delivery system question is an important, or a dimension to this is an important one. On the question of coordination, there's been, I think, some significant, political coordination or diplomatic coordination between the U.S., China, and other countries on North Korea. On the military side, understandably, it's much more. It's very sensitive. I've been involved in Track 1.5s and Track 2s on this. And you just talk about a hypothetical. What if North Korea collapses? Presumably. I mean, this is the way I play it out. Well, presumably, everyone will be surprised. It'll happen quickly. It'll be confusing. No one will know what's going on. And wouldn't it be good to have some sort of coordination? And as someone in Seoul told me many years ago, well, Andrew, what if North Korea collapses and nobody does anything? And first I thought he was just being deliberately provocative, but actually. It's likely to be very confusing and complicated, and it may not be clear who's in charge, what's going on. We may not really be able to tell if there's been a collapse or not. It may be very, very confusing. And who would want to dive into that? Right? There's going to be reluctance. I don't think, while the Republic of Korea plans for unification, this kind of event would take some important, would there be a time lag, you'd need coordination, of course, with the U.S., but other countries too. So it's not totally implausible. However, I would think, having come from inside the Beltway, I would think that there would be, if everybody does nothing and things continue to simmer and rumors will fly left and right, then one hill in the world people will be screaming and yelling, and that's Capitol Hill. Senators will be saying, what about those loose nukes and the missiles? Who's controlling those? And so I'm not saying that the U.S. will act first, but there will certainly be, I think the most pressure anywhere in the world will be on the U.S. and on whoever's in the White House to do something. And the nuclear issue is key, and those missiles. So put it to my Chinese counterparts, I say, some of those sites are pretty close to China. So that's going to be number one concern to the U.S. So wouldn't it be a good idea to talk about this beforehand, at least have some limited coordination? And they all not. But it's still getting from that hypothetical discussion to some kind of concrete, even if it's a loose, agreement about mechanisms for coordination. That's another story.
Please.
Yes, my name is Alison Evans from IHS Country Risk. And you mentioned how your team's research at RAND showed that stability was a higher priority than denuclearization for China. But I'm wondering why you think that China does not see North Korea in possession of an operational nuclear weapon as destabilizing, and what, if any, practical influence China has on North Korea's nuclear missiles development program.
Thank you. And then Matthew Cotty.
Thanks, Adam. Matthew Cotty, on work at the Proliferation Nuclear Policy Program here at WWS. One quick comment and one quick question, if I may. The comment, we organised a workshop in Beijing last week, broadly on nuclear issues, but obviously DPRK featured quite prominently. I would say that the frustration and anger, I share your view that it has increased demonstrably in the last few months particularly. And that now we were told that denuclearization certainly trumps stability in terms of how the Chinese are thinking about this. And the question is to do with UN SDR 2070. Your reading of this was obviously far more expansive than anyone really thought. The Chinese obviously sat on the US draft for a long time, but how do you read 2070? Is it a clear change in Chinese policy, or is it signalling to North Korea about what they're willing to do? Thanks.
Okay, maybe I'll answer that last question. I think it's too early to tell conclusively, but I think it's more about signaling. I think what China's really good at is signaling displeasure, whether it's to, it's just in Oslo. They're not very happy. The Chinese are still not very happy about a certain person getting a Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, some years ago. But signaling displeasure is what China does, and it has applied economic sanctions for limited periods of time. But in terms of following through for an extended period of time on sanctions like this, we just haven't seen it yet. That doesn't mean that it won't happen. It can't happen. But I think it's more about signaling displeasure. And at the risk of being somewhat facetious, I think there's this mindset in Beijing amongst some people that if we just make our displeasure known strongly enough, the other side will get it and come around. And that doesn't mean they won't. That they're not willing to really follow through. I think that the hope is that China has made those signals of displeasure so strong to North Korea, and after a limited period of time, North Korea will come around. But we have to wait and see. So I think it is a significant development in China's policy on North Korea. But we've just got to see the follow through. On the question of whether is it stability or nukes or denuclearization, in some way this is more of a question than a theory or a hunch that I have. I think that perhaps stability as a high priority where North Korea is concerned for China is increasingly less distinct from denuclearization. In other words, North Korea's nuclear program may be, in Beijing's eyes, becoming almost synonymous with the prospect of continued instability across the border. So, the good news, I think, is that if this is right, then there's this recognition that the nuclear issue or the nuclear program is something that has to be addressed. It has to be a priority, and it's linked up with stability, and yet that in some way that's the good news. The bad news is that makes it even more complicated from a Chinese perspective. And so, we were just Adam and I were talking beforehand, and one of the things China, the most frustrates China generally about anything, is uncertainty, unpredictability. They like to have an election and know who's going to win. They like to have a meeting and know what's going to be decided ahead of time. If you apply, even if China follows through on these tough sanctions, I think the concern in Beijing is, well, gosh, we don't know what the outcome will be. It might make things worse. Just like I can't help but mention a certain candidate for the U.S. presidency. I think what worries, after you chuckle and laugh about it, in Beijing or in any other capital, but especially in Beijing, what worries you about the prospect of a certain candidate becoming president of the United States is he seems incredibly unpredictable. And that is worrisome, would be worrisome from a Chinese perspective.
Yeah, they don't like Bernie. On this issue of denuclearization being trumped by stability, isn't that also arguably just a pragmatic reaction to the fact that the nuclear train has left the station, and the Chinese are very skeptical about the prospects of denuclearization? So of course they're going to emphasize stability. They continue to talk about denuclearization because what they're doing there is to uphold a norm that makes it more difficult for other countries in the region to nuclearize in response to what North Korea has done, and the South Koreans and the Japanese. So it's a talking point that has to be prominent, but it's not one necessarily that in respect of North Korea that they strongly believe in. Yes, please. Yeah.
Masato Kimura, Japanese journalist based in London. My question is about Mulambong, or North Korea girls ban cancellation and nuclear test. What is Chinese public reaction to Mulambong concert cancellation and nuclear test? And why do you think Xi Jinping didn't go to that concert and Kim Jong-un cancelled it?
This is the concert that the North Koreans were going to put on in Beijing, I think, and it's an interesting case. I'm not 100% sure, to be honest, but my understanding is that the North Koreans wanted to show video or photos of nuclear tests or missile launches, and when the Chinese objected, they refused to remove that, and so the event was canceled. So I think that's my understanding of it. But interestingly, some of my interlocutors in Beijing and Shanghai, several of them pointed to that example as, see, we're getting tough with them. I mean, there were other things, but that was one indication. And so that's what I mean. China emphasizes, signaling its displeasure. And let's face it, in a place like China, and a place like, well, any Asian country, but other countries too, but especially in a communist or a dictatorship like China or North Korea, symbolism and words they matter tremendously. So it's very different, obviously, to blocking, shutting down your border trade. But signaling these kinds of signals do resonate. So I don't want to minimize. I don't want to be completely dismissive of episodes like that. I mean, it does show that cancellation or China's efforts on that show that they do have some red lines, if you like, that they're willing to draw the line on certain things, even if it's more symbolic than anything else.
To what extent do you think sort of leadership issues enter into this? I mean, in China now there's a very strong leader who's centralizing power and acquiring new titles. Obviously, Kim Jong-un has got a certain force of personality as well. A young man in a hurry in many respects. I mean, do you think there's a degree of sort of mutual resentment and animus? Can neither of them really quite face the prospect of the obligatory bear hug in Pyongyang or Beijing at their first meeting?
We'll have to wait and see. I'm just envisioning that in my mind. Yeah.
Yes. Follow-on questions. You, sir. Yes.
Shaw from Chinese Embassy. I've got a question about recently I'm reading a memoir by Christopher Hills called Outpost, especially quite a lot of descriptions about the Sixth Party problems, what are the provisions, and I just wonder, in the American administration, between the State Department, Pentagon, and the White House, are there any consensus on policy towards the DPRK, or are there different interests among the group?
Yeah. Good. I haven't read Chris Hill's memoirs, but I certainly plan to. In any large or government, there are going to be bureaucratic differences. But I think there's pretty much unanimity in Washington. Perhaps the State Department's more open to, let's try something. But I think there may be some slight differences. But overall, I think there's unanimity that those North Koreans, they refuse to live up to their agreements. What's the point in even sitting down and talking to them if we don't have any kind of assurances ahead of time that they're serious? I remember, not that this is, Bob Gallucci, who negotiated the agreed framework many, many years ago. He was out of government. He was actually, at that time, I think he was head of the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. But he gave a talk about ethics and foreign policy, and he had a couple of case studies. And one of them was 1994. And he said, we're sitting in the White House and debating, what should we do about North Korea? Should we launch a surgical strike? And he said, I argued against it at the time. He said, but sitting where, knowing what I know now, if going back in time, I would have argued, let's hit him. Because at that time, we knew with a high degree of certainty there was one facility. Right? Fast forward to today, North Korea has nuclear facilities all over the place. There's no way that a single strike can hit, can take out their. In addition to it being incredibly provocative, right? So, in short, there are no easy solutions, whether you're sitting in Beijing or Washington, and so all the bureaucratic differences in the world don't make a difference at the end of the day, unfortunately, or fortunately. Maybe.
I'm afraid we've run out of time, but Andrew, thank you very much for that. For the China watchers amongst you, I'd just like to alert you to the fact that Nigel Inkster on the 20th of May is going to be chairing a discussion on another easy subject, namely the South China Sea, and the speaker will be the Chinese ambassador to the UK, Ambassador Liu Xiaoming. So do register for that. And in the meantime, Andrew, I hope you'll agree to come back rather sooner than you did from your previous talk about 10 years ago. And by all means, it would be great to hear a bit more about the PLA's influence in national security policy making. And thanks again for being here. Thank you.